It's that time of year again, where we all gather around, enjoy some spooks and scares, and maybe get some candy along the way. Because it's October, which means we are inching ever so closer to Halloween, the scariest time of the year. This also means I'm legally obligated to talk about a spooky yet fascinating piece of lost media in this video. And oh, do I have a treat, not a trick for you today, because we'll be talking about a piece of lost media that involves the spooky spirits of the early 1930s, featured in one of the first dramatic television anthology series ever, that being The Television Ghost. It's a tall tale about a show from a long-forgotten era of TV, and how we may never find this lost treasure ever again. So grab your popcorn, get comfy in your chair, because we'll be turning the dial back to 1931 to tell you the bone-chilling history of the television ghost. Join me, if you dare. Before we get into the history of this thrilling lost early television show, we need to set our sights way back to around a century ago, where we take a brief and oversimplified look at the history of good old television. In BrayBray terms, that just means me taking some info I saw on a Wikipedia page and then regurgitating it to you here. But anyways, much of the early tests, research, and development of TV goes all the way back to the early 1900s. In fact, the word television dates all the way back to 1900, with Russian scientist Konstantin Persky, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, being credited for coining the term. Many tests for this newfangled medium would occur over the next 2 decades. However, it wasn't until the 1920s when things started to become much more possible. This is the decade where mechanical television started to become much more feasible as a concept. Specifically, Scottish inventor John Logie Baird would do some of the first public television demonstrations throughout the mid to late 1920s. These demonstrations used a very archaic and unfamiliar form of TV that is very different from what we see today. In oversimplified terms, the way televisions worked during this time was that a spinning disc, often called a nipkow disc, and or several mirrors would pass in front of a neon lamp to create an image. The image would be translated using the various holes in the disc, creating scan lines, and thus a crude moving picture could be seen. While this system of TV worked, it wasn't necessarily the most practical way to televise moving images. Many of the downfalls of mechanical television can be contributed by the fact that it involved many complicated moving parts that were tricky and impractical, making a moving image hard to perfect. Even then, the results weren't anything special, with the largest resolution ever produced by a mechanical television system being just 240 lines, or the equivalent of 240p, at only around 20 frames per second. Yeah, the same quality that YouTube was pushing in 2005 was the same quality that mechanical television was trying to push back in 1935. Even then, the quality on most mechanical television systems was actually much lower. It even got to as low as 24 scan lines, the equivalent of 24p. This was just barely enough to make out a human face, and about the resolution of the security cameras at my local Kroger. Despite the downfalls of mechanical television, it was the main form of televising moving pictures to a broad audience for almost 2 decades. In fact, it wasn't until the widespread global production of the cathode ray tube, or CRT, where mechanical television started to fall out of favor in the TV market. Well, I won't go into specific details here, but all you need to know is that the cathode ray tube was a game changer when it came to television screen technology. It made all electronic television the most popular form of TV, and it eventually left the mechanical system obsolete. The last mechanical television broadcast would end in 1939, putting an end to the mechanical TV market once and for all. For our story, we need to go back to the year 1931, specifically July 21st of that year. This is when the television station W2XAB New York City would start roaming the airwaves as part of the experimental mechanical television branch of the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS. Now, the earliest mechanical television stations actually date back to 1928, when the station W2XCW would launch in Schenectady, New York. However, W2XAB would be yet another one of these stations broadcasting in the greater New York City area, with the first thing ever airing on the news station featuring then New York Mayor Jimmy Walker. The station would broadcast various events and programs throughout its first few months of existence. However, it lacked something crucial: a flagship show. When a television network launches, usually a show will premiere that would define what the network is and make the network recognizable in the public eye. A show that makes people say, oh yeah, that's that one show on that one network. This is a flagship show, and they can evolve and change over time along with the network's ideals. Of course, this is 1930s television we're talking about here, so the idea of what exactly a television show is was very loosely defined. During this experimental time in television's history, programming would air at often unpredictable and random times with no set schedule. The way W2XAB solved this was by becoming the first American station to implement a regular 7-day broadcasting schedule. The network would broadcast for 28 hours every week and place unique television programs in specific time slots. This meant that W2XAB could air narrative programs at the same time every week, basically inventing the idea of find out what happens next week on insert show here. This led to a rise in shows that could actually fit the mold of a television program, and this was mostly led by our good friend W2XAB. Shows that would air in the station's earliest days were Piano Lessons, a show where the absolute Chad Professor Gialdo Raniger would teach you how to play the piano, shows led by singers such as Harriet Lee and Helen Haynes, and finally the flagship show of the network, the main topic of this video, the one and the only television ghost. Premiering on August 17th, 1931 on W2XAB, New York City, The Television Ghost was certainly one of the first anthology horror television series ever made. Each episode would revolve around a different anonymous ghost telling their story of how they were murdered, which is pretty dark for one of the first TV shows ever made in my opinion. Despite the ghosts being different for each episode, the ghost was always played by George Kelting, a popular employee of radio stations in the New York area, such as WMCA. Other than that, I wasn't able to dig up much about the guy and what he did after his work on the show. The announcer role would go to Bill Skunt, W2XAB's station director and the station's only paid employee at the time. He would actually go on to do quite a lot both during and after his time working for the network. He was the main person behind W2XAB in its early years, and he eventually landed the position of manager at WKRC in Cincinnati, Ohio. He would retire in 1966, leaving a more than 35-year career in TV and radio behind him. The ghost costume involved a whole lot of white face paint as well as a white cloak to give the ghost a convincing look. In fact, a convincing look was actually quite needed, as not only was the show limited by the small resolution that mechanical televisions produced, but also the show was basically a glorified radio drama. The only movement you would actually see on the TV screen was a headshot of the ghost's head and shoulders. 1930s TV, people. 1930s TV. The series was also broadcast on radio as well, on stations W2XE New York City and WABC AM 970 under the alternate name Radio Ghost. The series was a 15-minute program, airing just behind the aforementioned Piano Lessons at sporadic times throughout its run, ranging from 8 o'clock p.m. to as late as 9:30 p.m. Like most television shows at the time, the show was filmed and broadcasted live, which was actually the biggest factor in the show becoming completely lost, but we'll get to that in a bit. But for now, let's hear a fun little piece of trivia about this spooky spirit of a show. Did you know that Mr. Kelting was actually implied to dress up in the ghost attire and walk around the W2XAB studios, scaring bystanders in the process? In an October 1931 article from the Daily Star, this is regarded as the truth, telling a story of how the ghost scared the employees silly. Quote, "The television ghost, the well-known Columbia artist whose identity, like that of the Shadow of a Former series, is concealed in connection with this series of hair-raising television murder mysteries, is causing some commotion around the CBS building's 23rd floor, where the experimental visual studio is located. Garbed in a sheet, his hands and face covered with a ghastly white makeup, he is far from a treat to the neurotic. To date, he has popped around corners to frighten one soprano, one supposedly brave lightweight fighter, and one of Columbia's porters, who dropped his broom and departed at excessive speed." End quote. The source where I got this from also states that 2 other articles refer to George Kelting actually scaring people at the CBS building. It's a pretty funny story if you ask me. The show would run uninterrupted for almost a year, until W2XAB would have to suspend its operations temporarily to catch up to new technological innovations in early July 1932. These involved the idea of both the video and audio signals broadcasting simultaneously on one signal. Before this, the video signal and the audio signal were separated due to the technical restrictions of the time. This meant that while the video would be picked up by the TV, the audio would have to be picked up on a completely separate radio station. In W2XAB's case, the audio would be broadcast on the station W2XE. Again, 1930s TV, people. 1930s TV. This would all change when W2XAB would come back on July 21st with a simultaneous video and audio signal, all made possible by the station's engineer Bill Lodge. And with it came back the television ghost, albeit with one big change. This time, the role of the ghost was handed over to Artels Dixon. Dixon also had quite a bit of a resume for himself outside of playing the spooky spirit, being involved in such plays as the Vagabond King and Nellie Bly during the 1940s. Not to mention, he also found other small roles in other smaller productions during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Other than this host change, it seems that the show would relatively stay the same during the rest of its run. But, as they say, some things just have to come to an end, and as for the television ghost, its demise came along with W2XAB. You see, W2XAB had been dealing with a lot of pressure from other outside forces. During the early 1930s alone, it seemed that the station suffered a lot of economic turmoil from the Great Depression, with the network never seeming to find itself on solid financial ground. It was also around this time where the concept of completely electronic television was starting to become much more feasible. With the aforementioned development of the cathode ray tube and more networks jumping on the bandwagon to test this new technology, even just a few years after its founding, W2XAB was already seeming like old news. Whatever the case was, W2XAB would close up shop on February 20th, 1933, and down with it went the television ghost. The spirits would hit the airwaves for the final time on February 15th, 1933, and thus we would never hear another peep from the first galleon ghosts of TV. W2XAB would not be gone forever, however, as it would eventually make a return in the early 1940s under various names before settling on WCBS TV in 1946, where the station still exists to this very day. So what exactly happened to the television ghost? Why can't we just get a taste of the show along with other 1930s television by looking things up on, say, YouTube? Well, there's an unfortunate truth behind this great loss of television history. If you know, you know, but I will tell you exactly why this was the case anyway. The technical limitations of mechanical television meant that the shows always had to be broadcasted live. However, the technology of the time did not allow the shows from this time to be recorded directly by the network. Due to these limitations, much of the shows that aired for the first 15 or so years of television history are now considered permanently lost, with no chance of recovery. And one of these unfortunate victims was the television ghost, along with the other shows that aired on W2XAB at the time. Even if recording these shows in some way was possible, say maybe with a film recording, it wouldn't be very practical considering that the resolution broadcasted on mechanical television was so low that the picture would be barely visible to the naked eye. It's pretty obvious at this point that the television ghost and its contemporaries are unanimously considered to be completely and permanently lost for the rest of time. The only real way I can think to find anything from this show now is to look into whether the radio broadcast was preserved. Yet since this was before radio content was also regularly kept, and just the fact that this show is more than 90 years old at this point, I doubt that anything would still exist even if it was preserved at some point. It's a sad and unfortunate fate for a TV show that's quite important to the history of TV itself. Considering that the television ghost is considered to be the first horror series, the first dramatic series, and the first anthology series, it has many feats and contributions to the medium of television as a whole. Yet very few people know about it, and I hope to bring more attention to its important but brief impact on the good old idiot box. Luckily, efforts to preserve television would improve in the decades following W2XAB and the television ghost. The introduction of the kinescope and magnetic videotape in the 1940s and 50s would allow for both live and pre-recorded material to be preserved. Eventually, the VCR market would come along and make regular consumers be able to preserve television in the comfort of their own home. Even with all these steps forward, television content was still seen as somewhat reusable, and thus content that was cheap to produce, such as game and talk shows, were still susceptible to junking practices even as late as the 1980s. But that's a story for another video. As for the television ghost, while we can safely consider it to be permanently lost, the impact and legacy it had on the television industry should not be understated. There's a good chance that much of the television we see today would be much different without the television ghost. It was not only the first dramatic anthology series, but it reinstated the idea of regularly scheduled TV shows as a whole. There's probably so much more this show did for TV that we simply just don't know about, but what we do know it did is definitely worth admiring in my opinion. So even even if we may never see or hear the television ghost again, we'll surely know that the first ghost of TV still haunts the airways to this very day, in one form or another. Be afraid. Be very afraid. If you liked this video and you don't want to miss out on any future videos here on the channel, make sure to click that subscribe button. It's free and it only takes a second. It would also be cool if you gave a like, dislike, or whatever floats your boat. But anyways, friends, this is BrayBray. Thanks for watching. And remember that buff Yoshi says, Happy Halloween, everybody!